So let's talk about agreement a little bit more, although actually a better word would be similarity, because we're not going to just be talking about agreement on political issues. We're going to be talking about similarity on a lot of demographic characteristics. When we talk about agreement, there are two different forms of agreement. There's partisan agreement and general agreement. And people tend to talk about politics with people who they agree, but that doesn't mean they only talk about people with whom they agree. And they might agree on a partisan side, but disagree on a general agreement side. Okay? Partisan agreement just means essentially you're in the same party. You're both Democrats, you're both Republicans. General agreement is more about when you discuss politics, how frequently are you agreeing? So you can imagine that you have two people who agree on 95% of things, but they enjoy arguing. So they only talk about the 5% of things in which they disagree. So they have partisan agreement probably, but they actually have high general disagreement and low general agreement. One way to think about this is to imagine three people who are friends. Let's imagine the first is a Republican who wants less immigration and doesn't care about taxes. The second is a Republican who wants to cut taxes and wishes the president would stop focusing on immigration. And the third is a Democrat who wants higher taxes and more immigration. Both Republicans have partisan disagreement with the Democrat, but everybody has some general disagreement with one another. So one of two things are likely to happen. Either A, they will avoid talking about those issues that they disagree about, or alternatively, they might just stop talking about politics altogether. But if they remain friends, there's going to be disagreement in the discussion network. It's just that nobody experiences it because they don't talk about it, right? So you do get these situations in which people disagree, but nobody actually experiences it. When we're talking here about political agreement, we're just talking about one area in which we might experience homophily. Homophily is the tendency of people to be friends with people who are like them. So in this case, we're talking about homophily with regard to political opinions. But the article Birds of a Feather are about other demographic characteristics that social networks tend to display similarity in. Also, it's important to remember that sometimes people will come together and have relations when they have a lot of differences. But a lot of times those relationships are not long lasting. So we see homophily both in terms of people choosing to be friends with people who are like them and also stop being friends with people who are different from them. Opposites do not really attract. The biggest dividing lines in the United States in terms of homophily are race and gender. Only 8% of people say they discuss important matters with a person of a different race. And in terms of interracial marriages, 1% of white people are in an interracial marriage. 5% of blacks are in an interracial marriage. The only groups that's out of the single digits are Asians. But even there, it's only 14% that are in an interracial marriage. The most famous data set in social networks is the adolescent health data set, which is looking at relationships among students in middle and high school. What they find is that about 85% of friendships for both white and black students are of the same race. For other racial groups, there is more diversity, but it seems that that's mostly because the students don't really have a choice in a lot of schools. They're in such a minority that they have to find these cross-race friendships or they won't have any friends. And note, this is not unique to American high schools. A 2004 study of Dutch high schools showed similar homophily by race. And actually, in the case of the smaller minority groups, there was even greater homophily in those groups than we saw in smaller minority groups in the United States. In terms of gender, typically the cross-gender relationships in social networks are spousal or boyfriend, girlfriend, that sort of thing. Almost all men say their closest friend is a man, and the vast majority of women say their closest friend is a woman. In terms of political discussion networks, cross-gender relationships are very rare. Tends to be just the spouses, as I said. Though it's also the case that when asked how much does a person know, husbands rate their female friends higher than their wives. Wives rate their husbands higher than their male friends. So why do we see so much homophily? Well, one of the reasons is, as I said before, you don't get to choose who you're friends with or who your family's with. You know, our choices in terms of who's in our social networks are constrained by the supply of people around us. If we live in homogeneous communities, then the people in our social networks are going to be looking just like us. You know, certain cities are diverse, certain areas are diverse, some neighborhoods, some states even, have mostly people of a certain background, a certain ethnicity, a certain political predisposition. And so the people you're friends with have those ethnicities, backgrounds, political predispositions. And that's probably the ones you have too. Another reason we might see homophily is that people see benefits to talking about people who are very similar to them and have similar backgrounds. You might have similar interests. It might also help you understand where that person's coming from, right? It doesn't have to be at all the case that I don't like people who are that way. It could be I like those people just fine. I just don't understand them, and they don't understand me the way someone who is just like me understands me. That often is a reason for the homophily. And then there might be homophily because of social pressure, right? Think about interracial marriages. It could be the case that you're perfectly fine with an interracial marriage, but your parents are not. And because of that, you say, well, I don't want to deal with it. If we want to talk about sort of what is the most important consequence of homophily for politics, it could very well be the segregation of ideas. If we think about what social networks are, and social networks are helping information flow across individuals, well, if all individuals of one type are in a cluster and all of individuals of another type are in a cluster and they don't communicate with one another, then the ideas are stuck in each of those clusters, right? And also the understanding of the two different sides are stuck within those clusters. We find, especially if we look at political agreement, we find is that if people tend to cluster into groups of like-minded individuals, they have a harder time understanding what the other side thinks about politics. They actually have a hard time explaining their own issue positions and why they hold those positions and why they're good. We will note they have an easier time deciding how to vote. They are more likely to vote. They decide earlier. Everything they have experienced tells them, you should vote Democratic or Republican. They never hear anything differently. So they don't hesitate to think, well, what should I do? People who are in more heterogeneous political communities, they tend to understand their positions better. They tend to understand the other side better. And sometimes that makes them think, I don't know who I'm supposed to vote for. My side has these points, and they sound good, but the other side has some points that sound really good too. In short, homophily is a fact of life. Demographic homophily is a fact of social networks, but also political agreement is a fact of political social networks. But we should note that just because there's homophily, a tendency for people to be with people who are like them and agree with them, that's not the only way that people form friendships and form discussion groups. And people do interact with people who aren't like them, and both in terms of demographics and in terms of beliefs. And when that happens, sometimes it leads to a better understanding of everybody's position.